Hello friends, today I'll be showing you how to make the cottagecore dress. There are two variations for the bodice. I'll start by showing you the more straightforward one and then the one with our embellishments second. The link to purchase the pattern is in the description box, or they're free to my $5 and above tier Patreons. Print out your pattern and then using your ruler, measure the lines on the side this time, there wasn't space at the bottom, to check it printed the right size. Then cut out your pattern pieces. I'm using the slim collar. And I'm using the non-Pintuck bodice. The lines around the neck for the bodice might seem a little bit confusing. The whole piece is needed if you're using the slim line. If you're using the wider collar, then you need to trim down to that first seam line. To put the collar in, we're going to use a facing, which means that we need to cut out an extra set of the bodice pieces. So one front piece and two back pieces. I'm using this plain white cotton to make it easier to show, but also this is the thinnest fabric that I have. If you're working with quite a thick fabric, this is a good idea. If your fashion fabric is pretty thin, then I just use that. So this piece needs to be cut on the fold. I folded the material in half and then I've just butted that fold cut edge to the fold. This means that when we open it out, we'll have a whole pattern piece for the whole of the front. I'm using tiny fabric scissors, highly recommend for doll sewing. This fabric doesn't have a right and a wrong side, but doing it this way, you will always get your pieces mirrored. So I'm folding that fabric in half and then cutting two pieces at once. If you want to cut each of your piece separately, then make sure that you turn the pattern piece over. So you do one with the writing up and then flip it over so you've got that mirrored side. I drafted this collar to be bagged out, which means that you'd sew two pieces right sides together and then turn them out the right way to get a clean edge on the collar. But my fashion fabric is really thick, so what I'm going to do is cut off the outer edge of the seam allowance, not the inner edge. Keep the inner edge, cut off the outer edge. I'm going to put fray check along the edge of this collar piece. You can do this with a thin fabric as well, either way is completely fine. This pattern is drafted with 5mm of seam allowance. And then we're going to do the same with the fashion fabric, so I'm cutting the bodice on the fold again. This fabric does have a right and a wrong side, so this way, folding the fabric over, I'm going to get the mirrored pieces for the back. This is like a flannel, so one side is brushed and then one side is plain. It's also really loose weave, but I'm going to show you a way to deal with fraying in a second. This skirt is designed as a dirndl, which means it's just a big old long rectangle that's then gathered down to fit the bodice. Super easy. You can do this for humans as well. Hi cat. But because this fabric is so thick, I decided to make the skirt a little bit shorter, like the length that will go around the doll. This is totally fine to do. I wouldn't go smaller than maybe 2/3 of the size of the full skirt, but yeah, you can make it smaller. You can make it bigger if you want, but it's already a very full skirt. I've cut two of the sleeve. These don't need to be mirrored because they're just a symmetrical shape, and two of the cuffs. I started working on the sleeve here and realised that the fabric will fray really easily, and decided to add glue all around the edge of every single pattern piece that I made. This is to make sure that it won't fray apart while I'm sewing it. If your fabric's quite stable, this is not necessary, but for a fabric that I'm struggling with, I'll always do this. It really changed my game with miniature sewing. I'm just using regular PVA glue to go around this. You can use a Fray Check product, but PVA glue is something that I always have in my stash, and I don't think it's waterproof, but I don't wash doll clothes, so not a huge problem just to use regular school glue or white glue for this. So to put this together, first I'm doing the lining. I'm just going to sew those shoulder seams together. It doesn't really matter what colour thread you use. I did use white, I don't know why. This won't be visible in the final dress from the outside of the dress at least. Remember, this has a 5mm seam allowance, so that means you're sewing in 5mm from the edge of that fabric. And then I'm doing the same for the outside fabric. This time I would recommend to try and use at least a similar coloured thread to the fabric that you're using. It doesn't need to be identical, but close is pretty good just in case it shows. Unless you want it to show, that would be a cute design feature, to be fair. If you're finding that your clothes are looking homemade rather than handmade, a distinction we have in the craft world apparently, iron your seams. This makes a massive difference and makes your clothes look a lot more professional than finished. So every time you've kind of finished a stage, iron your seams basically. So make sure at the very least to iron these two seams. And then what we're going to do is, with the fashion fabric seams down, we're going to add that collar piece, and then with the lining we're going to do seams up and sandwich that collar in. So I'm pinning it in a few places, making sure that that sandwich can't move while we're sewing. And then we're going to sew the whole length of like the back, the neckline, and then the back on the other side again. So this is going to both seam the back of our dress super neatly, but also it's going to catch that collar and give us a really nice finish on the neckline. I'm going quite slowly doing this. I sped up the footage, but I'm stopping and starting the machine to kind of manipulate the pattern underneath the foot. So I'll leave the needle down, lift the foot, turn the dress, which will give me a nice clean edge around the neck. And then I'm just checking that nothing's been caught while I've been sewing. I'm very good at catching. Then I need to trim off these corners to make sure that there's no bulk in that corner when we turn it out. And then I'm going to clip little cuts along the notches. Be careful not to clip the line of stitches. If we don't do this, this means that the collar can't turn out properly. And then I turned it all out to the right side. You might find something pointy like a screwdriver. I use a closed pair of scissors, which is not always a good idea. Sometimes it pokes through, to just make sure that all of the angular parts get turned out properly. This might seem kind of a tricky way to put a dress together, but it gives you a really good finish on a collar. I was trying to do different ways of inserting the collar, and this way just looks the nicest. To make sure the lining isn't visible around the neckline, I'm sewing together all of the inside seam allowances that are still left and the lining. I'm not sewing through the fashion fabric. This is called understitching. It is supposed to keep it down, but on this scale, not everything in human dressmaking works. I'm going to show you a different option if you're finding this isn't holding the lining down enough. So you'll notice that the sleeves are a little bit bigger than the cuff for the sleeves. You need to gather that down in some way. You could gather it down normally with a running stitch that you pull tighter, but I decided just to put a single pleat in. This fabric is thick, like I said before, and this will reduce the size of the bottom of that sleeve so that it will fit the cuff. I'm going to show you another way on the other dress that I'll show you. And then with the cuff piece and the sleeve right sides together, I'm just going to sew a running stitch the length of that. So we're going to open that seam back and then fold the excess over to finish off our cuff. I'm just going to iron that flat. Depending on your fabric, you can finger iron that. I'll show you a bit later what finger ironing is if you don't know, what finger pressing. And then we're going to stitch in the ditch. So that seam that we made earlier, we're going to put a line of stitches inside that seam to try and make it not visible. If you want to, you can just top stitch if you find that easier. The top of the sleeve is also drafted with a puff. This time I am going to just gather it, so I'm just sewing a running stitch and then pulling that tight. I am actually anchoring both ends when I've pulled it tight to make sure that those gathers don't pull out while I'm sewing it together. I actually did sew down some of the gathers by hand before attaching the sleeves because I was having some trouble with the gathers being pushed out. Pressing everything again. If you hate ironing, I hate ironing, I'm with you. Use your hair straighteners. They're like at your desk if you do dolls anyway, right? And it makes such a big difference if you do this. Like genuinely, it looks like your doll clothes have been bought rather than homemade. So handmade over homemade, right? So something that I've been struggling with always is putting sleeves in. What I've started doing is only sewing half at a time. So I tend to sew the front half first. So I'm only pinning the front, making sure nothing is tucked, sewing that, cutting that off the ends once I've sewn that, pinning the other half and then sewing that through. And I'm finding that my sleeves are set much nicer. There's not any caught fabric, but also it's so much easier. Something else I found is that if you have the sleeve uppermost, try and curve the fabric while it's going through the machine. This will stop any of the fabric getting caught around the arm's eye as well. If you do have any accidental tucks, I'd recommend stitch ripping half of that seam or wherever your tucks are and then just resewing it. If your fabric's falling apart, then you're gonna have to recut your pieces. I couldn't get the seam for the second half of the sleeve. It just wouldn't catch the fashion fabric properly, and because this is such an unstable fabric and it was starting to shred, I decided just to hand sew this part of the seam. Any of this can be done with hand stitching, like none of it needs a machine. I have tutorials on hand stitching if that's something you're interested in. I'm not sure if this is necessarily a beginner project, but I don't think it's that difficult either. The facing that holds the collar in does seem complicated, but I promise you it's not. I'm then folding that in half and matching the cuffs. I always match the cuffs and sew from the cuffs first, because if you've sewn everything straight, then everything else should line up, and we can hide issues in the waistband or in the underarm way easier than we can hide it at the cuff, because we've already hemmed that, right? Try and match it up as best as you can, but if it's not perfect, like mine's not perfectly matching up, it's not a huge issue. With sewing this seam, don't be too worried about that lining fabric. If it doesn't catch, it doesn't catch, that's fine. Make sure you get the fashion fabric. So So I'm going to move on to the other type. I know I've only showed you the bodice, but the skirt goes in the same way. So if you want to see how to put the skirt in, I'll leave timestamps just forward on there. This is the dress that I made for my Faun doll. If you want to know how I painted the fabric, check that video out. I'm hemming the bottom of the skirt with a hidden stitch, a blind stitch, blind hem stitch, one of those, I'll link it, which is just a really long stitch at the back and then a tiny stitch at the front. So it's a running stitch, just uneven. It means that you can't really see it. I do machine hems as well, and I think they look okay, but this one's if you don't want that line of stitches showing. So this is our Pintuck bodice piece. I'm creating these tiny little folds. This is finger pressing, so I'm just running my nails along to set that seam in there. I'm then pinning it, and then I am putting a basting stitch in. So I'm using a bright pink so that I can see it for when I take it out. The basting stitch is just temporary to hold it before I get it under the machine to add the stitches along the Pintucks. So I'm doing 4 Pintucks in total, 2 on each side, but I'm going to do 1 on each side first, sew those down, and then add the second ones. I didn't film the first ones, I don't know why, but I did film the second ones going on the machine. It's just a running stitch along those tucks. I'm then folding the middle in half and then sewing it down to make kind of a false button placket. You can stop here, but you'd need to make your Pintucks a little bit wider because it's designed so that it has these details. You need to check against like a normal size bodice. I'll show you in a second. I'm just sewing this flat now just to make sure that when we add all the other pattern pieces that it will be sewn in the correct place. Later I'm going to add some tiny little doll buttons and those will hold this panel flat. I'm just checking there to make sure it's the same size. If it's too big or too small, it might not necessarily fit the doll. It's quite a forgiving pattern, so it shouldn't make a huge difference. The only difference with this one is that because I'm using the wide collar pattern, I've cut down to the second seam line. This collar I'm bagging out, so I've cut 2 pieces and then I'm sewing those together, right sides together, just around that outside seam line, not the inside one. That happens when we put the bodice together in a second. I'm cutting the seam allowance down to about 1 or 2 millimeters, kind of the lowest I think I can get away with, basically, just to make sure that it's not bulky when we turn it the right way out. And clipping this notch in the middle just for good measure, just in case, to make sure that it turns out cleanly. And then I'm turning that piece right sides out. Little bit fiddly, might need something pokey again to get the bits out. and ironing again. If you're just watching this out of curiosity, if you take nothing else from this video, please iron your little tiny doll clothes. Again, sandwiching this together in the same way that we did the tartan bodice, no difference. And then sewing one back seam around the neckline and the other back seam, same way as the tartan bodice. So again, I'm cutting those corners off, but also with this one, I'm cutting away the seam allowance, again, in the same way that I did the collar, cutting it down to 1 or 2 millimeters, again, as much as I think I can get away with. And then turning that right way out as well. So this one, instead of understitching, I decided to top stitch. So this way I'm sewing through all of the layers, so through the lining and through the top layer, but not the collar. The lining really wanted to pop out with this one, so this is just more securely holding it below the line of the collar. I only did it like kind of across the front of the bodice. I didn't bother doing it across the back panels. I'm pulling that white lining down quite a bit as well, that's where it's pinned. So to make this sleeve smaller, I'm doing a box pleat, so that means you pleat like one side in a little bit and then pleat the other side in to match it, to meet it in the middle, and then I'm sewing that down and then just constructing the sleeve in exactly the same way as I did with the tartan bodice. And then I'm setting the sleeves in the same way that I did in the tartan bodice. I filmed setting the sleeve a lot better than I did with the tartan one, so I'm going to try and show you a little bit what I mean by kind of pulling the fabric while you're sewing. I'm trying to kind of put that fabric the way that I want it to be once the garment's finished, so hands in the way, I'm afraid, but I'm kind of curving it upwards a little bit. I didn't show this on the tartan bodice actually, but this is super important. You need to clip along the arm's eye, otherwise you're not going to get your doll's arm in it. The arm's eye is smaller than it needs to be to fit the doll's arm, so usually I'll sew down the length of the side seam and then clip, but this time I decided that I would clip before, so that's the same way that we did with the collar on the tartan dress, just putting those little relief cuts in, not quite to the stitch line. I decided to use my machine to gather this, so set your machine to quite a long stitch, just regular running stitch, and then sew a straight line across the top of whatever it is you're gathering. It's way easier with a dirndl skirt, I guess, because it's just a rectangle, right? And then what we're going to do is keep those thread tails long. And then pull the bobbin thread. So I know the bobbin thread is at the bottom, and I know that that's the underneath one. If you're struggling with this, maybe use a different colour in your bobbin, but yeah, just pull that and push the gathers along the length of the skirt. If you're really worried about this being completely even, check out my Cottagecore video, because I have some tips for that. I'm not super worried. This is a pretty full skirt and I'm trying to get away from perfectionism, so I'm just like evening those gathers out by eye, and then I'm grabbing the bodice and making sure that the skirt is gathered down enough to fit that bodice. So you'll notice at either end of the skirt I've left a little bit with no gathers. This is because we're going to hem that bit anyway. So I'm doing a little bit of an overhang there. I want this to be kind of under bust, so rather than putting the skirt right at the edge of the bodice, I'm going to go a little bit higher. This is totally personal choice. If you want this the way it was designed, then match those two edges and then sew with a 5mm seam allowance. I'm using a lot of pins to hold this together while I'm sewing. I find that really helps with keeping the gathers even and making sure that they're not pushed out while it's under the sewing machine. And then I'm sewing that with a straight stitch under my sewing machine, making sure to take those pins out as I get to them to make sure not to sew over them. I'm using a seam ripper to cut that thread that I used to gather the skirt. If you put it within the seam allowance, then I'd leave it, but because this is visible, I'm taking it out. Because I moved the skirt placement, there's quite a lot of like excess that will bulk up the seam, so I'm just cutting that away. I'm matching up the bottom hem and then pinning that. If you're a little bit worried that you haven't sewn everything perfectly, then match the waist, don't hem before, sew the back, then hem, if that makes sense. So I'm just sewing a straight stitch right down the back of the dress, leaving enough room to get the doll in and out. I'm a big worrier about like the strength of seams, and I've had issues with this part of the seam. I'm putting my sewing machine to a zigzag stitch, making the length of the stitch really short and the width of the stitch about 3mm, and then I'm just sewing a bar tack, so that means it'll go side to side really fast and make a really strong little point there to make sure that that seam doesn't tear. used a blind hem stitch on the back there as well, just those little bits of extra hems, because I didn't want top stitching on this dress. It's not a feature of the dress, so I just didn't want to do it really. I didn't want visible stitching. Something I didn't show was to make sure to trim down the cuffs, otherwise it'll be quite tight around your doll's wrists. Wrists. It's like mid forearm, I don't know. Then you just need to add your closures. I add a snap at the waist and at the neck, and then you're done. Link for the pattern is in the description box. Thanks for watching, thanks for buying. Like, subscribe, do the YouTube things. Whatevs, happy you're here. Thanks again, bye.